History. Today we are going to be looking at the ethics of Pompeii and Herculaneum in regards to the assessment tasks that you're going to be doing. So this lesson will be specially catered towards answering the ethics question in regards to that assessment task. I will do another video to the next question as well. But for this lesson, it's just the ethics part. Okay, so this lesson will probably be a bit of a slightly longer one. So you are not watching this in your normal class time. This is sort of your study materials. It's to help you along. So it is going to be a slightly longer one, but maybe you can speed up my voice and it'll help you along. So, what is our question? Well, we've got a statement or a quote and then the actual question itself. So the statement is, all further human remains uncovered at Pompeii and Herculaneum should not be displayed to the public. Now, one of the things that I would like to point you towards is keep in mind the wording of the question. All further, okay, so that means anything else, okay, doesn't mean all stuff from the past, it means anything discovered in the future. Now, you can also interpret that as we should also be covering up the things from the past that we have discovered, okay, but you can interpret that as you will. All further human remains, okay, so bodies, of course, not just full bodies as well, though, it could be also sections of it, so literally one skeletal arm, uncovered or excavated at Pompeii and Herculaneum. Please remember in your responses, you have to do both sites, should not be displayed to the public. Now, very important point there, that little section at the end, should not be displayed to the public. Now, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be studying them. It doesn't mean that they should not be excavated at all. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing any archaeological processes at Pompeii and Herculaneum. It is simply saying that the bodies that we retrieve from Pompeii and Herculaneum should not be on public display, meaning the average person should not be able to see them. Okay? That's what it's saying. Keep that in mind. It's not saying that we should stop scientific study of them. Now, the actual questions are, how have the ethical issues relating to the display of human remains at Pompeii and Herculaneum changed over time? Okay, so we're looking at ethical issues here, and we'll go through that little word in a second. But we're looking at how they have changed, okay? Which means that in your responses, you have to talk about how we originally viewed displaying of human remains at Pompeii and Herculaneum, and then progress as you go along. How has it actually changed, okay? You can't just start at the end, and you can't just stay at the beginning. You have to do the progression, okay? So, when we're doing this assessment task, here's a recommendation of things that you might consider, okay? First of all, you might want to make a timeline of the ways human remains have been treated and displayed at Pompeii and Herculaneum until contemporary time. Timelines are really useful for this particular question because, once again, it's a progressive question. It's asking you, how has it changed? The second one, what are the benefits and negatives of displaying human remains to the public? What are the alternatives? That's really engaging with the statement. Okay, that's engaging with the statement, okay? Should they or should they not be displayed to the public? Because remember, you have to really strongly engage with that statement in this response because they've given it to you for a reason. If you don't engage with the statement, you're going to lose a lot of marks. What examples have there been of human remains being treated poorly? What alterations have we made to stop this from happening again? So once again, looking in the past, how have we treated human remains? Well, the hint is not very well, okay? But then what have we done now or later on to actually change how we've treated them, okay? And remember, it's all about the change. How have these views changed, okay? Really get that into your head. Because if you're only writing about how things are now, you're going to miss out on a lot of marks, as we were saying before. So first of all, what are ethics? Okay, well, ethics in the very simple sense are moral principles or beliefs that govern how people behave. Okay, Now, important thing that I always explain in regards to this, it has nothing to do with legality. It's more about how to act in society. For example, it's frowned upon to lie, but not illegal except in certain circumstances. Okay. My quote with this one has always been to explain the difference between a legality issue and an ethical issue. Whilst it is not illegal to pass wind in an elevator, it is unethical. Okay, meaning you probably shouldn't do it, but you're not going to be dragged off to court for it either. Okay, unless you've done a really horrific one and you manage to injure someone. Another thing that you should note in regards to this assessment task is when we're discussing ethics in regards to Pompeii and Herculaneum, we are not talking about how the citizens themselves behaved and if they were good or evil. We are discussing how we, us archaeologists and curators, exhume and then display their remains. Keep in mind, you're going to hear this word exhume a lot. It means to dig up. Okay? So, how do ethics come up in Pompeii and Herculaneum? Well, when we look at ethical practice in Pompeii and Herculaneum, we are largely looking at issues relating to the treatment and display of human remains. An example of this can be found in the plaster cast remains first implemented by Giuseppe Fiorelli. Okay, so there are other ethical issues in regards to Pompeii and Herculaneum besides just a display of human remains. There's a whole bunch of conservation issues and land rights issues and things like that. However, for this particular question, we are focusing on those human remains. So that's the particular ethical issue that we're looking at. Okay? So when we're talking about this ethical issue, these plaster casts should really have a big part of what your argument's going to be. Okay, now I'm just going to stop sharing that little PowerPoint at the moment, and I just want to go over something else. Okay, let's just quickly have a look at what the assessment task is actually asking us to do. So, Ms. Sullivan would have gone through the outcomes with you already. Let's just go a bit deeper dive into what this actual question's asking us to do. Okay, so the nature of the task. You will write an essay in response to the following question. All further human remains uncovered at Pompeii and Herculaneum should not be displayed to the public. How have the ethical issues relating to the display of human remains at Pompeii and Herculaneum changed over time? So exactly what we'll talk about before. We're going to skip that next question. I'll do something else on that later. Okay. So, what is your actual task? Now, you will explore the historical debate surrounding either the ethical display of human remains or the impact of tourism, conservation, and preservation at Pompeii and Herculaneum. You will do this through an investigation of the evidence and various perspectives. Okay? Now, those are two very important things. Okay? Investigation of the evidence, meaning you are going to have a wide array of evidence in regards to this task. Okay, it's very similar to the historical investigation that you did in year 11. It is just smaller in depth, okay? But you need lots of evidence for this task, which means that you should be quoting a lot of different sources, okay? And also looking at the various perspectives, okay? Which means you need to have a whole bunch of different perspectives in regards to ethical remains. Is it right that we display them? Is it good that we dig them up? Is it done appropriately? You need to have different perspectives on this. You can't just be focusing on one side of the argument. Okay? It is in some ways a discuss question. Okay? Meaning you have to have both sides of the argument present if you want to really get that top mark. As part of your research, you are encouraged to locate key areas of debate within this topic. Some issues that you may choose to discuss, keep in mind that it's some issues that you may choose, okay? Which means that's not all of them. There are other issues that you can look at, okay? You can look at ethical considerations, including changing perspectives from the past, okay? Very relevant to our one. Tourism and income generation. So, for example, should we keep bodies on display because they are a big tourism generator and a big income generator for the site and its archaeological process? Creating a legacy for future generations. Should we allow future generations to see what we have done, even if it is the bad stuff? International and Italian contributions. So, not just looking at Italian archaeologists and historians, but looking at what the world over has provided. Maintaining context for current and future historical narrative. Now, this one is something that really applies to us, okay? Maintaining context. Now, what that might mean in regards to our question is something in regards to when the bodies are moved and they're placed into different positions, especially for narrative purposes, it has changed the entire context of the historical narrative. And that's a very dangerous thing to us as archaeologists and historians because it completely warps what we think might have happened. Now, you will need to ensure that your essay is a maximum of 1,200 words. You have clearly outlined and identified key perspectives on your chosen topic, and you have made a judgment about the key concept in your topic and provided evidence to support your judgment. So it is like a discuss question. You have to discuss the various perspectives, but at the end of all things, you're expected to make a judgment. Okay, and that's quite important. You have to have that judgment. So if we're looking at the marking guidelines, and we'll have a look at what we need to get in that top range, okay? Presents a comprehensive and reasoned judgment about the key concept in the chosen topic, okay? Comprehensive and reasoned, okay? Now, what do we mean by that? Well, we're meaning comprehensive means very detailed and covers all of the opinions, okay? Reasoned means that you have evidenced your understanding and your judgment, okay? Demonstrates extensive and accurate historical knowledge and understanding about Pompeii and Herculaneum. That's another one, Pompeii and Herculaneum, it's both, okay? Extensive and accurate, well, extensive means that you have to go over a wide variety of archaeological and historical sources, okay, as well as the varying perspectives from modern historians. Accurate means exactly what you might think it means. You have to be accurate, you have to be correct, okay? You have to have a good understanding of Pompeii and Herculaneum and the archaeological processes regarding it to get into that top mark. Supports the response with interpretation and well-selected evidence from relevant sources and referring directly to the quotation. Now, referring directly to the quotation. Now, what this one means is that you are really engaging with that quotation that you have been given at the start, okay? You're engaging with it and you're either supporting it or challenging it, but you're engaging with it strongly, okay? Supports the response with interpretation and well-selected evidence, okay? What that means is you've got a whole bunch of evidence and then you have actually analyzed it in a meaningful way, correctly, and you've integrated it into your response, okay? Also keep in mind, well-selected means that it's relevant to what you're trying to argue. You haven't just slapped in some evidence there just so you can say, well, I've got two sources for this paragraph now. Presents a logical, cohesive, and sustained response using appropriate historical knowledge, concepts, and terms. So, of course, this little section here, okay, appropriate historical knowledge, concepts, and terms is all about our terminology, okay? Are you using proper archaeological historical terminology? If so, you're going on the right path with that little section. Logical, cohesive, and sustained, okay, is all about your ability to actually construct an essay and to basically say that you're not changing your points and your arguments every single paragraph of the essay. It's logical and it's cohesive. I can read it well, it flows, and I completely understand what opinion you're trying to make, okay? Keep in mind, as Miss was saying here, your essay is a maximum of 1,200 words. That means I do not want to be reading a 2,000 essay just because you really, really wanted to include those extra paragraphs and sources. It's 1,200. It's to make your argument concise. Okay? So, let's go back to the presentation. Right. So, let's have a look at the history of ethics in regards to human remains in archaeology. Now, this whole idea of ethics and human remains in archaeology is a relatively new one, and it's been staked out largely by minority groups such as Native Americans, Aboriginals, and Torres Strait Islander peoples who believe any interference with the human body after internment, meaning placed into the ground, or whatever funerary ceremony they have, is a desecration, meaning you are taking their holy or sacred rites and you are basically turning them on their heads. Okay. Now, of course, we have many issues with this in Australia, particularly in regards to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Okay. But it's a big thing that has been staked out with them. Europeans, and to a certain extent Asian cultures and things like that, they have different values in regards to the dead and what we can and cannot do with them, particularly when we're looking at it from historical and archaeological senses. But these sort of native groups, such as the Native Americans, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, it's a very black and white view of whether you can touch the dead. And when they're dug up by archaeological teams and things like that, it's a no-no for them, plain and simple. Okay? So, on the picture to the right, we have Bob Weatherall. He's an Indigenous man and chairman of the Indigenous Cultural Policy, who has argued with multiple museums for the return of Indigenous remains to native burial grounds. Okay? Now, you might be asking, okay, I see where we're talking about human remains here, but sir, what does this have to do with Pompeii and Herculaneum? Well, remember that I'm telling you right now, this whole idea of ethical remains, of ethical treatment of human remains, is largely staked out by these key groups. Are these key groups involved in the Roman Empire, and particularly Pompeii and Herculaneum? No. Okay, so what we're saying here is this is an issue that hasn't particularly hit Pompeii and Herculaneum yet. Okay, it's mostly done by these key groups, but it doesn't mean it's going to be not hitting it in the future. Okay, and it's nice to be able to use these little comparative arguments and say, okay, if we're really considering the arguments of these Indigenous people, why are we not applying them to our own cultural settings? So, let's have a look at the history of ethics in regards to human remains in archaeology. Okay, well, early excavation. Sorry, just let me move that. Early excavations, human remains destroyed in quest for precious finds. So we went through this one at the beginning, and we basically talked about how the Austrian generals at the very start of the excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum were basically just digging into the city looking for marble. They didn't care really what they found unless it was valuable. And then human remains were just destroyed along the way. And even past those Austrian generals, we do have this whole idea of archaeologists are there to find fancy buildings and gold and stuff. They don't really care about bodies, so they literally just push them away. It's not until that sort of 19th century that we get any sort of consideration, not respect, just consideration about what to do with human remains. When we're looking at early excavation or early professional excavations, these remains were often deliberately positioned into tableau to dramatize them and excite visitors. And a tableau is basically a stage setting. So they'd actually be moving around the skeletons to get them into these positions where they'd go, oh, this was a family gathering, or they were playing cards, or they were running away, and they'd be purposefully setting a scene with them, okay, trying to tell a story. The skeletons and human remains were almost viewed as actors on a stage. In the 20th century, Amadeo Maiori uses children's skeleton to stage a tableau in the room of the weaving girl, attached to the house of Neptune and Nefertiti. So, as late as the 20th century, and Maiori is an archaeologist that has a lot of good and a lot of bad going for him, but they're still using these skeletons to stage these tableaus. And keep in mind, Maiori was a man that was very much dominated by his times and political circumstances. He wanted to tell a story in regards to Pompeii and Herculaneum, relating it back to the Roman Empire. So it's no surprise that he staged these little tableau productions. So it's important to remember that we do have variances in attitude towards display of human remains around the world, as I was saying before. Now, attitudes towards the display of human remains changes drastically from country to country. Whilst most of the Western world has undergone a shift in countries, a shift in opinions, it's meant to say, sorry, countries like Italy, in countries like Italy, the display of human remains is culturally accepted and has not faced much opposition. For example, the Capuchin crypts in Rome are decorated with human remains, which has been a custom in medieval and Renaissance Roman Catholic areas. Unlike in many Western countries, there is a strong recognition of the aspect of death there. And you can find this in a lot of these, what's called the Romantic countries in Europe. These are the countries that have a Latin form basis as their language and still have Roman Catholic roots in them. Spain, France, Italy, Austria. Artwork, particularly from the medieval and Renaissance periods, does use a lot of actual human remains to go in there. You can walk into France and Italy and just find entire crypts and temples and churches made out of human bones. And it's not that they're disrespecting it, it's simply the fact that this is a culture that grew to accept death around them, especially around the Black Death and the Plague period. Okay, so it's almost a religious custom with them. Even in Catholicism today, you do have a sort of acceptance of death and things like that, and human remains are not uncommon displays in Catholic displays. So you have to think about it that way. These guys are not viewing it as a desecration. They're simply looking at it going, meh, it's not that different. So how were human remains treated prior to the latter 20th century? Okay, well, this one is from Estelle Lazare. The skeletons were subsequently stored in such a way that they became disarticulated, meaning they fell apart from each other. This diminished the amount of information they could provide and discouraged a number of scholars from initiating research projects on the Pompeian material. Despite this, there was a tendency for scholars to make proclamations unencumbered by evidence about the composition of the population of Pompeian victims of the eruption. So what Estelle Lazare is saying here is basically, prior to this sort of acknowledgement of human remains, nobody really cared about them. They were sort of thrown around. You'd have skeletons being separated from each other, so you couldn't actually tell which one's connected with what. And amidst all of this, you have all these archaeologists and anthropologists making all these claims about, oh, this is what we think what the human population of Pompeii was like, and blah, 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 blah. And everyone's sort of sitting there, and Estelle including, going, how can you make that assertion when you haven't even studied the human remains? Because they just weren't viewed as important, which is an amazing fact considering that they're probably one of the most important and crowd gatherers at the moment for Pompeii and Herculaneum. So this is an example of unethical archaeological practice regarding the human remains, and this comes from the House of Menander. So the House of Menander, sitting in Pompeii on the south side of the Vicola di Menandro, has long held interest due to its rich trappings, designs, and full skeletons. It's effectively a mansion owned by the rich, and it's always interested the archaeologists and historians that have come there because it's just basically exquisite. Okay. Now, when we first came into this house, we found that it was full of skeletons. Okay, and archaeologists became very, very excited, or at least we thought it was full of skeletons when the research papers came in. Estelle Lazare in 1980 discovered, however, that these 10 skeletons were tampered with by Maiuri, who, by noting that some skeletons had been put together from multiple skeletons, shown by having 2 left arms, for example, and adults having children's teeth. So Maiuri, like we were saying, great man, but also a man deemed by his own vanity, okay? Damned, I should say, rather. He put together all of these skeletons from different body parts because he basically wanted to put on a display, a tableau, and he's just shoved them all together, okay, with no absolutely no regard to all the different people that he's basically handling together like some sort of monster Frankenstein, okay, and he's put these 2 together, and he goes to the archaeological community, he goes, look at me, look what I found all these skeletons, they're all perfectly preserved, and the archaeological community, by Estelle Lazare in 1980, went, hold on a second, something's not right. Okay, so he tampered with it with no regard to the human remains. Okay, and this is generally how they were treated, as something that you could put a show on for. So one of the questions that we can actually ask today is, do we respect remains nowadays? So it's very easy for us to go, stupid 20th century archaeologists didn't respect anything, put them into little displays, no respect at all, okay? We're not that much better, okay? Whilst we have made significant strides in regards to respect towards human remains, we are still not innocent. The meme picture, as detailed by Finn, and you can follow that link there, is an example of unethical usage of human remains, which according to Finn, it is worth remembering that this wasn't Wile E. Coyote's great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, as suggested by one Twitter user. It was a man seemingly with mobility issues who died alone, and if we are to accept this archaeologist's interpretation, that he was turning to look back at the impending pyroclastic flow, very afraid. Okay? And this one in particular, this is probably one of the best known memes from Pompeii. It has the poor person that's been running away, and then basically a massive chunk from the volcano in the city has just plonked him straight in the head. Okay? And he's been known as the unluckiest man from Pompeii. And we've had a whole bunch of jokes at his expense. But what Ethan's basically trying to get us is, you wouldn't do this if this was someone who literally died just yesterday. Okay, and this is a poor woman that was running away from a volcano yesterday, and then she got clunked by a big volcanic piece. You wouldn't laugh, so why are we laughing 2,000 years later at this poor person? Okay, now, there's a lot of different opinions on that. I think one of the opinions is time plus tragedy makes comedy, okay? But he does raise a great point. Why do we laugh at this one? Okay? So what are some things that we have changed? Well, whilst we still display human remains in museums and on site, there's been a significant change in how we do so, and there is now an established way of how to do so, recognizing that they are sensitive material, okay? And this goes in particular for Australian museums. Australian museums are very reluctant to hold any sort of human remains for public display, particularly in regards to any sort of Indigenous issue, because as we were talking about at the start, the Indigenous people do not appreciate having the human remains of their ancestors on display, particularly when a lot of those human remains were stolen during the colonial era and imperial era. Okay? Human remains and materials of sacred significance must be displayed in a manner consistent with professional standards, and where known, taken into account the interests and beliefs of members of the community, ethnic or religious groups from whom the objects originated. They must be presented with great tact and respect for the feelings of human dignity held by all people. So this is the Code of Ethics for Museums, which was made in 2004, and basically, for all major archaeological works, all museums follow this code of ethics. If they don't tend to be allowed to get those major archaeological works. And it's basically this idea that if you want to display human remains, you have to actually do it in a sensitive manner and not be a jerk about it, basically. There's another little catch onto that, which basically says, at no point can you take the ethnic consideration of the human remains and make derogatory statements regarding it. That was a big one in the 19th and very early part of the 20th century, where basically museums were taking human remains of, for example, African individuals, and they were basically saying, oh yeah, look at the African individual, you can note the inferiority of his form, you can see that the head was a bit bigger but the brain was smaller, blah blah blah. It was a lot of unsubstantiated theories, and they were basically just doing it to do racial supremacy. And the museums has made that a little tack on, saying you can't do anything in regards to race, in regards to that. It's not important to the archaeological account, and it's definitely not ethical. Okay? Now, I would like to just point into there, taking into account the interests and beliefs of members of the community, ethnic or religious groups for whom the objects originated. So when we're looking at Pompeii and Herculaneum, okay, and we're applying a code of ethics for museums in 2004, that's a bit of a tricky one, okay? The ethnic or religious groups for whom the objects originated. Now, technically, of course, those Romans and Italians, okay, are the ancestors of the modern day Italian state. However, there's significant ethnic differences in between all of those. You could argue that the Romans of 2,000 years ago are not the Italians of today. Okay, so you could basically say, what right do they have to make an ethnic judgment on those ancient Romans? And particularly when we're looking at religious groups for whom the objects originated, when the volcano goes off in 78 AD or 79 AD, we are looking at a polytheistic society still heavily involved with the imperial cult and the Roman pantheon, not what is today the majority dominated Italian Roman Catholic / non-religious groups. Okay, so you also look at that code of ethics and go, well, what right do they have to impose their values on it? It's absolute minefield in regards to ethics. Okay. So another one that was a really nice one for a quote, which was basically, wherever possible, the use of casts should replace the actual object. Okay, and this relates back to Giuseppe Fiorelli's casting use, okay, where he doesn't actually use the bodies, he just fills the space where they used to be with that plastic or resin mold, okay, and he's basically, what Richard Ford is saying here is we should always just use the cast anyway, because that way you don't have that sensitivity issue. You're not actually displaying human remains, you're displaying a cast of it, so why don't we just do that? Okay, it's a tricky one. So what are the display of human remains in the Australian context? Okay, well, Australian museum directors passed a resolution that human remains would not be displayed in museums in 1984. Now, I would say not every Australian museum follows that. There's still a couple of museums that do display human remains, okay? And it's left up to the exhibition curators and individual museums themselves, okay? So most museums in Australia have agreed not to, but not all of them. Now, the museums of Victoria decided not to display human remains of Vikings in their display Vikings Beyond the Legend. This is in the early 2000s. To avoid offending Indigenous visitors after previous conduct towards them. So obviously Vikings are not Indigenous people, obviously, but the Melbourne Museum basically went, look, we understand that a lot of Indigenous people's remains were stolen previously, and although these are Vikings, we're worried that it might trigger the Indigenous people walking into this museum and they'd basically be thinking about all the stuff that we previously stolen from them. So we're just going to avoid the issue completely and not display any human remains. Whether that's right or wrong, that's up to you, but that's what it is. That's what they did. So, although we've had all these resolutions passed and we've changed our ethical stances on it, a lot of people are still up to the same tricks in regards to the treating of human remains. So, whilst most archaeologists have moved away from telling sensationalized stories with human remains and tampering with them, it has not been universal, meaning not everyone has done it. Sarah Bissell, whilst working for National Geographic, added jewelry to skeletons to get more prominent photos. Okay, so this was a bit of a controversy. So we did find this skeleton with some jewelry. You can see there, yeah, it's at the tip of the finger. Okay. However, what they actually did was they moved the jewelry onto the skeleton to give it a more prominent position, to say like, this is a person of wealth, blah, 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 blah. And they did it just to get really good shots. And this is not the only shots that Sarah Bissell did, and it's a really good one to actually look up her name in regards to the ethical treatment of human remains as a case study. She will give you excellent stuff. It's important to note that she was working for National Geographic at the time, not as an archaeologist, but it still goes to say like they allowed her to move those human remains in order just to get a more perfect shot. And when you think about it, how is that really different from the tableau displays that they were doing in the 19th century and the 18th? Okay. So one of the questions that we might ask is, why are human remains so important to archaeologists? Now, this is to archaeologists, not to the public domain. Okay, so we're going to pull into that one in a second, but this is for archaeologists. Human skeletons are indispensable, meaning they are very valuable, for archaeological research. Ancient diets, disease pathologies, genetic patterns, and environmental adaptations are but a few research areas that osteoarchaeological remains can illuminate. So basically what Richard Ford is saying here is we need these skeletons to understand all these different things about the society. Okay. The next one. Archaeologists and anthropologists, if you don't know, an anthropologist is someone that studies human societies, have long considered archaeological human remains an important source of information about both biological and cultural aspects of prior human population. Data derived from human populations of all ethnic and socioeconomic groups are critical to our understanding of many aspects of modern human biology, as well as to the field of forensics. Okay, this is by A. Cheek and B. Keel. Okay, so basically what we're saying is without human remains, we have significant gaps in our understanding of the populations of these times. Okay, we can look at some archaeological evidence and historical evidence and figure out the general patterns of things and like that, but the study of human remains can tell us a heck of a lot about how average human people lived in those time periods. Okay, think about what we did with the Minoans. We could find out the entire diet of Minoans just by looking at their teeth. Okay, it's very important to remember that. So why are human remains so important in regards to Pompeii and Herculaneum specifically? Okay, well, it's one of the rare cases where we have intact Roman bodies due to their fondness of cremation at all social levels around this time period. So this time period is of course called the late Republican, early Imperial period. Now, this stopped being a thing around about the 2nd century AD. We're looking at the 1st century BC, okay? No. Sorry, we're looking at the 1st century AD, my apologies, at the moment for Pompeii. So it was still a big thing around about then, but it started falling out around about the 2nd century AD, 3rd century, possibly because Christianity was on the rise, and Christianity is not a big fan of cremation, or at least early Christianity wasn't. The bodies are incredibly well preserved relatively to other human remains that we have found. So not only can we find whole bodies here, which are quite rare for Romans during this period because they like to cremate everyone, but they're just so well preserved. Okay, and because of the way that many of them died, many human remains are in situ of their context, seemingly stuck in time because they were basically instantly frozen. Okay, so we really like finding these bodies because it gives us a great look at the context that was going on. So just looking at this, why did the Romans cremate their dead? This is a dramatisation of the cremation of Caesar made famous in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar. Now, cremation remained an important funerary act for the Romans, believing it would purify the body and prevent political enemies from desecrating it. So it's a really nice thing for us to be able to find all these bodies in Pompeii and Herculaneum and be able to piece them together because we simply just don't have much biological evidence from those periods. So now here's a more direct question in regards to our actual question for the essay. Why is it necessary for the public to see human remains? Well, first of all, it provides a more direct and immediate link to the past. It allows the public to really connect up with Pompeii and Herculaneum in a really instant manner, okay? And it assists people who enjoy learning from the display of human remains and encourages its study. So if we were to suddenly take out human remains from all the museums, we actually risk damaging people's interest in archaeology and stymieing or stopping further people from becoming archaeologists, because that might be the thing that really pushes them over the edge and encourages its study. Okay, and we want more people to be engaged with the study of human remains so we can learn more things. Okay, but there's also a couple of selfish reasons that we might want to see the human remains. It makes us aware of our own mortality. So when we can see people that are dead, we start thinking about the fact that we ourselves can die. And Pompeii and Herculaneum have long held that opinion in European belief. It's long been this thing where the Europeans have been absolutely enraptured with this whole idea of One day you have a thriving city that's going absolutely perfectly. The next day it's buried underneath a kilometre of ash and everyone's dead. And they like to think about their own mortality. The other one that we have is morbid voyeurism and profiteering. Now, what that means is morbid voyeurism is basically people that just like to look at dead bodies because it interests them. Okay? And profiteering means there's just people that basically make money off this, and that's why they want the public to see human remains. But one of the other things that we can say for the public to see human remains is we also want to respect archaeologists' previous contributions. And Fiorelli, the man that came up with the body casts and things like that, he made great contributions to archaeology, and we should be displaying these human remains because we want to show that Fiorelli did make these contributions, and this is how it helped our understanding of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Okay, and those are big deals. So what are the dangers of displaying the human remains? Well, there's two big ones, okay? The first one is it may offend visitors. Thus, warnings have to be put up and remains placed in separate rooms. You can't have the human remains with all the other same archaeological artifacts. You want to be able to say, like, if you're going to this room, you're going to see human remains. And Richard Ford, as we were looking at before, basically says, wherever possible, the use of casts should replace the actual object to stop this thing from happening and to stop people incidentally getting offended. Okay? We also have the idea of vulnerable to damage and theft from the public, such as the theft of the casts from the Pompeian Museum in 1975. So a whole bunch of casts were actually stolen from the Pompeian Museum in 1975. We never got them back. Okay, and if you have these human remains out there, they're just likely to be stolen, or they're going to be damaged by some stupid tourist who was running when they shouldn't have been and fell over a glass case. Okay, and there's been a lot of people basically saying, like, how is it right for us to have all these human remains in these glass cabinets for everyone to see, and they're just gathering dust on these glass cabinets? How is that respectful? Okay. Although the use of resin casts rather than plastic was discovered in 1984, which was hardier and more detailed, resin casting is trickier and more expensive, meaning it's not often used. So we do have a way to produce more protected casts rather than the plastic ones, but it's just so expensive and so difficult to make that we often don't, even though it is a really big boon of displaying human remains. So what's in the future for Pompeii and Herculaneum regarding remains ethics? Well, Pompeii and Herculaneum have not suffered any real ethical controversy over the display of human remains. However, since the whole question of ethics is ongoing, it is hard to know just what new sets of guidelines will be applied to Pompeii and Herculaneum in the future. If you actually go up to your Cities of Vesuvius book, there's actually a really great quote in there from an archaeologist's name I forget, and you can look in the human remains section where it basically says, people are only just starting to deal with this issue, not because they actually care, but just because they're so insecure. And archaeologists are only dealing with it because they're insecure that if they don't deal with it, someone's going to come down on them like a social justice warrior or something like that, and they're going to go, oh, you didn't treat these properly, so we're just going to boycott your entire work, and that's why they're being overly protective of it. Whether you agree with that or not is a different question, but that's one of the things that they've expressed. So in the future, you might see human remains being more closely guarded and not displayed, simply because the archaeologists are insecure about what reaction that they might provoke, even though there might not actually be a reaction. So what can we do to sum up all of this stuff? Well, there's actually a really nice little brainstorm here that I stole off someone, okay? And it's a really nice way to start off your actual essay in regards to this, okay? So there's a whole bunch of points here that I won't go through. You can go through at your own time, but I would strongly recommend that, particularly looking at Pompeian and Herculaneum evidence, that you use a lot of this as the basis for your essay, because there's some nice stuff there to get you started off, okay? And the point here comes from Megan Hicks, okay, which is a historian and archaeologist in this regard. Is a whole bunch of things. This is from one of her lectures, summarizing the main points in regards to ethical treatment of human remains. Now, that's it for that. I recognise it's been a longer lecture to this one, but hopefully you've gotten something out of it to help start your assessment task. If you have any questions, please email me or Miss Sullivan. If not, I hope you have a lovely day and I will see you again soon. Have a good day.